All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to get into a topic that's, well, it's pretty heavy, but it's also incredibly important. We're talking about necropolitics. Think of it as a powerful new lens for understanding how power really works in our world, especially when the stakes are literally life and death. And that brings us to the one question that's at the absolute heart of this entire explainer. It's a tough one to ask, but we have to. Why is it that some lives seem to be protected, nurtured even, while other lives are systematically exposed to danger and the risk of death? So to even begin to answer a question that big, we have to start with the basics. In this first section, let's just get a really clear handle on what this word necropolitics actually means. Now, a really helpful way to understand this is to see it as a kind of dark reflection. See, you might have heard of biopolitics. That's the power states use to manage populations, right? To make them healthier, more productive, to basically foster life. Well, necropolitics is the other side of that coin. It's not about making life. It's about the power to decide who gets to live and who is, in essence, allowed to die. Okay, so here's the formal definition, and it's key. The term comes from a philosopher named Akil Mbembe, and he describes it as the use of political and social power to literally determine who lives and who dies. And this isn't just about outright killing. It's also about creating the conditions through neglect, through policy, where whole groups of people are just left to die. And you might be thinking, okay, this sounds like some heavy academic theory, right? But it's not just an abstract idea. It has these really deep historical roots. So for our next section, let's trace this idea from the colonial era all the way up to today. Mbembe traces this power way back through history. He argues it really gets its start in colonialism, where entire groups of people were dehumanized and basically placed outside the protection of the law. This was then perfected, he says, on the slave plantation, which became this ultimate space for exercising total power over someone's life and death. And now, in our time, those old techniques are mixed with modern state bureaucracy and high-tech military control. And this quote from Mbembe himself just hits the nail on the head. He wrote that the colonies are the ultimate necropolitical spaces. You can think of them as these terrible laboratories where the power to treat human beings as disposable was developed, refined, and made to seem normal. Now, where does money fit into all of this? Because, let's be real, it almost always does. This power over life and death is very often tied up with economics and profit. So in this next section, we're going to look at the economic engine that can drive these kinds of systems. And that brings us to a related idea called necrocapitalism. So if you think of regular capitalism as profiting from labor and making things, necrocapitalism profits from vulnerability, instability, and even death itself. It's an economic system that actually finds a way to make money from dispossession and human suffering. So how on earth does that actually work? Well, it tends to follow a really grim kind of three-step logic. First, certain groups of people are labeled as surplus, not really needed for the economy. Then, these same groups are made disposable through things like incredibly dangerous working conditions or just total neglect. And finally, profit is actually made from their vulnerable situation. Think about industries that pop up around detention centers or for-profit prisons. These are systems that can literally turn someone's suffering into a business. And it's so important to get this next point. This isn't always about quick, spectacular violence like a war. The idea of slow violence from a scholar named Rob Nixon is so crucial here. This is about harm that happens gradually, over a long time. Think of a community being slowly poisoned by a factory's runoff, or the health problems that build up over decades from living in a polluted area. The damage is spread out and delayed, but in the end, it's just as deadly. Okay, so we've talked theory, we've talked history, we've talked economics, but where does this stuff actually happen? Necropolitics isn't just an idea floating out there. It physically shapes our world. This section is all about the real-world places where you can see these forces at work. Scholars have pointed to several key types of spaces where this kind of power really gets concentrated. You can see the historical links with places like the plantation, but also think about more modern examples, like refugee camps, prisons, or heavily militarized borders. These are all places where normal laws and protections are often suspended, and state power over life and death is at its most extreme. And all of this leads to the creation of what some geographers call deathscapes. And that term is so powerful. These aren't just places where bad things happen by accident. They are landscapes that are actively created by political decisions and neglect. For example, when a border policy pushes migrants away from safe crossings and into a deadly desert, that desert becomes a deathscape. It's a place where death isn't just a risk, it's an expected and maybe even accepted outcome of a political choice. I know. This has all been incredibly bleak. But understanding this concept isn't just about listing all the terrible things in the world. It's about getting a new, really powerful tool for seeing how the world works. And that is exactly why it matters. The philosopher Judith Butler really gets to the moral heart of the whole issue with this quote. She talks about the racialized bifurcations of lives, which is a fancy way of saying the dividing lines that our society draws to determine whose death is a tragedy to be mourned and whose death is just ignored or negated. That question right there is what necropolitics forces us to look at. So, at the end of the day, what's the big takeaway? This isn't just some abstract theory. It's a new lens, a way of seeing. It lets us see the hidden logic behind violence that might otherwise seem random. It helps us understand the historical and economic systems that make some people so much more vulnerable than others. And maybe most importantly, when we can see these power structures clearly, we can also see just how important resistance is and how the simple act of survival can itself be a powerful political statement. And that leaves us with one last crucial question. This isn't just about history or theory. Now that you have this lens, now that you can see the patterns, where do you see necropolitics at work in the world right now?